Hello, it's John Heaton. Before I start this video, just want to tell the people who've requested stuff that I do plan to do those reviews and others along the way. I'm not sure when, but Exile on Main Street is definitely going to be one of the next I do, and I need to do some more Dylan as well, so appreciate your patience. Today I thought I'd do a kind of connected video to the one I did last week. Last week I talked about what the Beatles thought of each other's solo career, and this week I thought I'd talk about a bit about the Beatles split, and then about the rumours surrounding a possible reunion in the 70s, and then finally end up by talking about the Anthology project, which came out in the mid-90s. Okay, so I think most Beatles fans agree that the Beatles split at the right time with retrospect, because they went out on a high and opened the space up for the solo careers, etc. But at the time, most fans were pretty upset and they couldn't understand it. But I think John made the point that if they'd stayed together, they literally would have had to record a double album every time they went into the studio. And in 1970, they'd probably have to record a quadruple album to fit all the material in. So that would have been a bit ridiculous. As for the reasons for the split, there are so many, too many to go into this video, but obviously the arrival of different partners on the scene and the difference of opinion over management contributed, and musical differences as well, particularly between John and Paul, and maybe between Paul and George as well. So they split, and the whole world was told about it and got the impression that it was Paul McCartney's fault, because that's how it was reported in the press, because he was the one who took the others to court in the last day of 1970, and he was the one who had come out with that rather terse interview to promote his first solo album. So Beatles fans were pretty much in the Paul camp or in the John, George and Ringo camp, and many who were neutral probably sided with John and George and Ringo because they didn't want the Beatles to split up. So Paul had a bad time in the early 70s against the backlash of that, and the critics laid into him as well. And so the thought of a reunion was really quite unthinkable for the first couple of years, because they were just fighting publicly in court, publicly in the newspapers and in the music press, particularly John and Paul. Hardly a nice word to say about each other. So it's quite ironic that the first proper opportunity to present itself for the Beatles to reform was in fact the Bangladesh concert in New York in August of '71. And as we know, George and Ringo played at this gig, so that was already half of the Beatles. And a lot of people know that John was invited and agreed to perform with Yoko, and George said, "Sorry, no Yoko, mate. It's you on your own or nothing." And John got upset by that and stormed off in a rage, and they fell out for the next couple of years. I think Paul was also invited, and he confirmed it and said, "Well, blimey, what's the point? We've only just split up. Why should we be getting back together?" But George did extend the hand of invitation. And in the Peter Doggett book, You Never Give Me Your Money, he's rather, not angry, but he's disappointed that the Beatles didn't take this wonderful opportunity in the cause of such a great cause to raise money for the Bangladeshi refugees, why they didn't swallow their pride and reform. But I think it's a bit much to place such responsibility on the Beatles' shoulders. After all, they had literally given their whole lives, day in, day out, for 5 or 6 years, no privacy at all. And they split for the best of reasons. And just to get together, even for a charity cause, I don't think it should have been expected of them. And I think it would have been a mistake, actually, because Paul was just finding his feet solo-wise. So was George, or had done the previous year. And they were all exploring new territories. I think it would have been a bit unnatural for them to come together. Pun not intended. And then in '73, '74, when relations thawed and Alan Klein was actually asked to leave, that opened up a lot of possibilities, and John and Paul started saying nice things about each other in the press, and they actually, all of them, said it was a possibility that they could reunite. That probably reached a peak in about 1974, and the music press picked up on this and were running articles regularly throughout 74, and hardly being discouraged by the ex-Beatles, with the exception of George, who, when he arrived in the US for his Dark Horse tour, bluntly said, I think he was asked the question, he said, I'd join a band with John Lennon any day, but not with Paul McCartney. There's nothing personal, just from a musical point of view. So that upset Paul, and so that put that stopped any momentum that there was. I don't think they would have reformed. And then as the 70s wore on and John took up a sabbatical, they seemed to be, as George said, they seemed to be growing further apart more than anything else. And when John made a comeback in 1980, he was asked the inevitable question. He said, it's like a high school reunion, and I was never one for high school reunions. So move on, be here now, don't live in the past. So, and then obviously John was taken from us. But I think they did, I think John heard some radio station playing Glass Onion, and the DJ said, I want to thank the ex-Beatles for not getting back together, which pleased John. And I think that's right. I think in the 70s they could have got back together. Commercially speaking, it would have worked probably, and even artistically speaking, it would have been interesting for sure. But I think they were right to resist it. And with John gone, there was silence on the subject. Of course, although the press said, well, you can just get, a few years later, you can get Julian Lennon to stand in for John, but that was never going to work. So radio silence for the next 15 years, really, after John's death. And actually, I just followed a podcast yesterday, which James Griffiths recommended to me, thanks James, which was an interview with Mark Lewison, telling the story behind it. In the mid-80s, I think 83, 84, it came out that Paul was earning more money from Beatles royalties than he had per the original contract through a 1975 Capitol deal. And George and Ringo were not aware of this, and they were absolutely livid. So that was their reaction, right or wrong, because Paul had been somewhat screwed through Klein, so you could argue that maybe he deserved to get something back, I don't know. But it was a long interview, very interesting. And so the three Beatles were at loggerheads for quite a bit of the 80s, really, or Paul and the others were. So in the 90s, eventually they were persuaded to come back for the Beatles Anthology. So they recorded 2 tracks with demos from John, Free as a Bird and Real Love. And I thought they did a decent job with Jeff Lynne producing, and considering the quality of the vocal on the original tape, they did a fantastic job. Do they rank alongside the top songs of the Beatles' heyday? Probably not, but they're kind of, as George said, they're the Beatles now as opposed to then, so sounding a bit more modern in terms of production. And it was just really nice to have a new Beatles record, and I know a lot of the press laid into them and saying, what are you doing? You're ruining everything. And it's just 2 tracks in 25 years. It's hardly anything excessive, and I think they did a good job. What I perhaps object to a little bit more is those 2 songs were used to sell these CDs. So Anthology 1, 2, 3, sorry. And Anthology 1 kicks off with Free as a Bird, which has nothing to do with the material. It's completely chronologically out of sequence with the rest of the material on that. And Anthology 2 opens with Real Love. This seems like a fish out of water, really. And then Anthology 3 doesn't open with anything, because the 3rd track was rejected by George. It was a kind of weakish Lennon demo. I think it was called Now and Then. So that never made the light of day. But I think to use it to sell those was a little bit cheap. And I actually have a bit of a problem these days walking to a record shop and seeing, not that anyone buys CDs these days, but even on Spotify or something, seeing Anthology albums in the rack alongside, the albums like Abbey Road or Hard Day's Night. And I would hate the casual fan to say, okay, let's get a Beatles album. What should we get? Let's get Anthology, because it's not the right way to start. Let's face it, it's not the right way to start. And much of it, when presented as finished work, is a little bit lacking, you know, especially on Anthology 1. There's some rough material here, quality-wise. Very interesting historically, and on disc 2 of this, when you get to the Hard Day's Night period, it's much more interesting. Anthology 2, which this is my son's vinyl, is much more satisfactory, and with superb outtakes from Rubber Soul, and it's on the beautiful Apple label, so it's worth getting just for that alone. Much more successful. Anthology 3, a mixed bag really, because the White Album tracks I don't think work too well in demo form, but the Abbey Road tracks are very interesting to hear, as are the Let It Be tracks. Actually, on the White Album I enjoyed hearing Ringo's vocal with the piano intro without the strings. I just listened to that today. It was very interesting. So that's the Anthology. So in summary, I think they were right to split, but I think, as they've all pointed out, the manner of the split was disappointing in terms of how bitchy it was. After all, you had this as the band was singing All You Need Is Love a few years before, and Here Comes the Sun a year before, suddenly squabbling with each other in public over money. A little bit disappointing that it happened that way. Such a beautiful thing as the Beatles couldn't just like fade away into the sunset, and had to explode rather acrimoniously in the short term anyway. So I would have liked, had John lived, I don't think I would have liked the Beatles to reform, but I would have liked them to be friends with each other and meet and maybe do an interview on TV with all 4 of them or something like that. Over the years they've said mixed things about reunion. Obviously the David Wigg interviews in 1970 are very interesting. Ringo is asked by David Wigg, if there's anyone likely to get the Beatles back together, it's you. And Ringo said, well, they say that, I don't know why. Maybe it's because I'm so nice. And then in the same interview series, George Harrison says, you can't split. Physically, you can't split. Well, maybe physically you can split, but spiritually you can't split. Because if you're listening, I'm the walrus too. So that was quite a nice remark from George, not often repeated, that kind of positive remark. Paul said it was like reheating a souffle, which is quite an interesting quote. So, and John, as I say, was very forceful. His best comment on the Beatles split was in the 1971 New York interview, when he said, it's like a rugby team, sometime you'd have to go off and get married and leave the boys on a Saturday night, and that's how it is. And very succinct, the way he summed it up, saying that by the time the Beatles were at their peak, they were suppressing each other and cutting each other down to size. And then he made the remark, if people really need it that bad, all they need to do is get each album, put it on tape, one of me, one of John, one of Paul, one of George, one of Ringo. If they really need it that bad, and actually I am as guilty as probably many of you for doing that exact thing. And I compiled, in the days of cassettes, I compiled no less than 4 double albums covering, I think the first one covered 1970, and the second one was 71, and the third was 73, 4, and the fourth was 79, 80. And they're fantastic albums. And it's kind of a fun thing to do, because if you can imagine the Beatles staying together, and it's not completely out of the question that they would have done that. After all, the Rolling Stones are still together to this day. But the difference there being, I think there's only one real main lead singer, and they weren't intruding on each other's space, in terms of the Beatles had 3 songwriters in the band, and there was literally no room, plus all into different things. So anyway, comparisons are odious. I don't want to compare it to the Stones. So that was my reflection on the Beatles split and the Anthology series. Thank you for watching. See you next time.